Hello everyone. Today we want to talk about enzyme inhibition. There are three types of enzyme inhibition, that is competitive inhibition, non-competitive inhibition, and uncompetitive inhibition. Okay, so let's look at competitive inhibition first. So this is competitive inhibition. This is enzyme, this is substrate, and this is constant Ks, and this is reverse constant. This is product. Okay, so when enzyme want to bind with substrate, or substrate want to bind with enzyme at active site, they also have inhibitor that is structure normally same as substrate. So here, inhibitor might have more affinity to react with enzyme at active site than this substrate. When that happens, substrate cannot bind with enzyme. When substrate cannot bind to the enzyme, so enzyme affinity to substrate was decreased, and when enzyme bind with inhibitor, it become enzyme inhibitor complex. So the only way that we need to do to make our substrate can bind with enzyme is we need to increase this substrate concentration to affinity. Okay, when we increase this substrate concentration to affinity, substrate can compete with inhibitor and can form enzyme substrate complex and dissociated to make enzyme and product. So the Km of this competitive inhibitor was increased because we increased the substrate concentration, so the Km was increased. But Vmax, or maximum velocity of this inhibition, was normal because increasing the substrate concentration still make normal amount of product. It doesn't change the product. So the Vmax is normal or remain unchanged. Next is non-competitive inhibition. When we look at this inhibition, we can see that enzyme, substrate, and inhibitor can bind together to make enzyme substrate inhibition complex. Why can be like that? Because when an inhibitor bind with enzyme, it does not bind at active site, but it bind at allosteric site. When inhibitor bind with enzyme at allosteric site, the substrate still can bind at active site of the enzyme because it does not disturb the substrate. Because of that, it can be the enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. So when this complex was created, we still can make enzyme substrate complex to make the product. So how can enzyme substrate inhibitor complex can be enzyme substrate complex? This can happen because inhibitor can be released out from this process. When inhibitor release out from this complex, it can be enzyme substrate complex and can make product. So in this non-competitive inhibition, the Km was normal or remain unchanged because we does not increasing the substrate concentration in this process, but the maximum velocity of Vmax was decreased because when enzyme substrate inhibitor complex was formed, not all of this complex was transferred into this enzyme substrate to make product. Some enzymes still form this complex and does not change to enzyme substrate. So some enzyme can form the product. That's why the maximum velocity of Vmax was decreased. The third one is uncompetitive inhibition. This inhibition is a little bit different from those two inhibition, because inhibitor only bind with enzyme substrate complex. Okay, when enzyme substrate was bind to become enzyme substrate complex, inhibitor was bind with this complex to make enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. This inhibitor bind at enzyme at allosteric site. When this complex was formed, there's no product can be formed. And not all of enzyme substrate complex can was bind with inhibitor, so they still can make the product. So at this uncompetitive inhibition, the Km was decreased because when enzyme substrate bind to form enzyme substrate complex, not all of this complex can make product, so the enzyme substrate complex was decreased. When this decrease, the concentration of substrate also decrease. Then the concentration of substrate affect the Km, so the Km was decreased. The Vmax also decreased because when inhibitor bind to enzyme substrate complex, it form enzyme substrate inhibitor complex, and this form cannot make the product, so the Vmax was decreased. That's all from me. Thank you.